Good morning and welcome to this latest Middle East Institute event entitled Syria and the West, the Efficacy of Economic Sanctions. My name is Charles Lister and I'm a senior fellow here at MEI, where I direct our Syria and counterterrorism programs. Throughout the past decade of Syria's crisis, US and European policy has experienced a number of strategic shifts, from hesitancy to indecisive engagement to determinedly countering a symptom of the crisis, ISIS, and now to what might be described as a status quo approach. Unsurprisingly, none of these approaches have done much, if anything, to transform, let alone resolve the root causes driving the conflict. But amidst all of this wavering engagement and shifting approach, one aspect of Western policy has essentially stayed the same: sanctions. Going even beyond the 2011 uprising, the US and Europe have maintained and built upon an expansive and complex array of sanctions against Syria's regime for roughly 30 years. Much of this has been driven by the regime's status as a world-leading state sponsor of terrorism. While much of this sanctions activity has been punitive in nature, and particularly over the last decade, this period of the Syrian crisis has seen the West seek to use sanctions not just in a punitive way, but as diplomatic leverage to break through a persistent deadlock that has faced negotiations over Syria's future. But despite all of those best intentions, sanctions haven't brought such results. As such, they have become the subject of intense political and analytical debate. For some, sanctions remain of some value, not a solution, but one component of a more holistic strategy. And for others, they're of no diplomatic use whatsoever and are merely a source of humanitarian suffering, even if unintentional. So today's event follows on from MEI's publication of a new study by one of our panelists, Karam Shaar, entitled A Comprehensive Review of the Effectiveness of US and EU Sanctions on Syria. I hope all of those tuned in today and anyone interested will take the time to check out that study. There is plenty of interactive infographics based on an enormous amount of data that Karam and his team have gathered. To discuss all of this, I'm honored to be convening a really excellent panel of experts. First up, we have Karam Shaar, who is a non-resident scholar here at MEI's Syria Program, as well as the research director at the Operations Policy Center and a senior lecturer at Massey University in New Zealand. Originally from Aleppo, Karam's work focuses especially closely on Syria's political economy, and until recently, he was also a senior analyst at the New Zealand Treasury. Next, we have Natasha Hall, who is a senior fellow at CSIS's Middle East program and has over 15 years of experience as an analyst, researcher, and practitioner in complex humanitarian emergencies and conflict-affected areas, particularly in the Middle East. Most recently, Natasha's worked at the Sheikh Group, where I also worked years ago, GIZ, Mayday Rescue, and the Center for Civilians in Conflict, and the US government's Refugee Affairs Division. And she's worked in over 15 countries across the Middle East, Africa, Asia, the Southern Caucasus, and Europe. Next up, Jomana Qaddour is a non-resident senior fellow with the Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council, where she runs the Syria portfolio. Jomana is a doctoral student at Georgetown University's Law Center, where she focuses on ethno-sectarianism and its impact on constitutional frameworks in Iraq, Bosnia, and Syria. Jomana is also a member of the UN-facilitated Syrian Constitutional Committee as part of the Syrian Civil Society Group. And she's also a co-founder of Syria Relief and Development, a humanitarian organization working in northwestern Syria that's implemented over $100 million of aid. And finally, we have Andrew Tabler, the Martin J. Gross Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he focuses on Syria, the Levant, and US policy. Andrew is the former senior advisor to the US Special Envoy for Syria engagement and the former Syria director at the National Security Council. Before joining WINEP all the way back in 2008, Andrew lived, worked, and studied in Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Tunisia, and Turkey. And he spent some of that time as the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Syria Today, Syria's first private sector English language magazine. So with those introductions out of the way, in terms of format, we'll be beginning today with each panelist offering a very short 5 minutes of opening remarks, reflecting on the sanctions issue, however each of you sees fit. I'll then moderate a discussion between the panel and then open up to questions from the audience. To all of those of you joining in today via Zoom, Please feel free to pose your questions at any time throughout today's event using Zoom's chat function or question and answer function. For those live streaming via MEI's website or on YouTube, you can email your questions to events@mei.edu. I'll be keeping across all of those questions as they come in, and I'll be doing my best to work as many of them into the event as possible. So without further ado, let me pass over to Karam to start with some of his opening thoughts.
Thank you, Charles. I thought I would first open by a quick remark and then a summary of the study. I think my remark is we all understand that this is an extremely contentious subject, and I just want to say why I think this is actually the case. I think it's because it's incredibly difficult for us. I actually think it's impossible for us to establish causality using empirical methods, which means that none of us can come up with evidence as such to support our arguments. We can all try to use our best judgment when we're arguing about this topic. Now, to me, this has two implications. The first is we all need to be humble. We could be getting it wrong. And the second thing is we need to also understand where others are coming from. Most people who talk about this topic actually have very, very good intentions, as you said, Charles, as well. So we just need to understand how they're looking at things. So with this, I think I can tell you a little bit more about the study that Wael Al-Alwani and I wrote for the MEI. It was published earlier this month. So over 6 months, what Wael and I thought we need to do is to analyze the data collected by Ammar Al-Naqib and myself, where we built a research tool that tracks all sanctioned Syrian individuals by the US and the EU. So we collected variables on their, say, age, association, nature of the association with the Syrian regime, their profession, whether they're part of the army, whether they live in Syria or not, ethnicity, religion, and so on. So the first thing we relied on in this study was analyzing that wealth of data. The second thing is to review the literature. Some great work has already been done in that area, so we tried to go through those as well. And then finally, try to take a qualitative approach. Just because of what I said earlier, you can't really establish causality with this kind of work. So we had to take an advantages versus disadvantages approach. Now, the second thing I want to talk about, so I don't want to tell you about the findings because I think the recommendations will actually tell you what the findings were. The recommendations were, first, this might sound counterintuitive to some people, keep and lift the sanctions at the same time. So we're saying keep some sanctions and lift others. You use some of them a lot more and lift some as soon as possible. So the first recommendation is scrap all forms of country and sector-based sanctions. These work like wrecking balls. They hurt everyone, not for a good reason. If you want to use them, you can use them for a very, very short time period, but you can't just keep them in place for a long time period, which is what's happening currently. Now, these need to be lifted in exchange for real concessions. We should not give this to the Syrian regime for free. This might come perhaps in exchange for releasing political prisoners. Instead, we think you need to expand the use of other types of targeted sanctions, including travel bans, asset freezes, and secondary sanctions. And I'll talk about secondary sanctions a little bit more later on. Then I want to say what Charles already said and actually wrote about at the MEI, implement a more active whole of Syria policy. And the key words here, I think, are two, not only whole of Syria policy, but active policy. So you need to show interest in that topic. You need to be dangling a lot more carrots and using many more sticks to get the al-Assad regime to change its behavior. And some of that active policy will need to be done with Assad's allies. And we mentioned some examples of such policy in the paper. I think we also need to expedite the legal steps taken against regime officials by leveraging universal jurisdiction legislation in Western countries. Some very shy steps have been taken on that front, but I think we can do a lot more. And then finally, improve the effectiveness of sanctions by taking a multifaceted approach. So first, we need to target the deep networks of the regime. So we shouldn't be just trying to target the tip of the iceberg, which is what's currently happening. Currently, you have some people sanctioned for being a state minister. They do absolutely nothing. They have a very, very marginal role in the regime. Yet, if you look at heads of security branches, some people who are known to the public, they're still not sanctioned, although you can more or less guarantee that they're involved in torture against Syrian civilians. And then I think we need to make a greater use of secondary sanctions. This is extremely useful. So far, the United States has just threatened to use it, but it hasn't used it, not even once. What we need to be telling others is, if you work with sanctioned individuals, whether your work is related to sanctionable behavior or not, you will be sanctioned. You should not be helping them. You should not be empowering them. And finally, work with local organizations to understand the structure of the Syrian regime, help whistleblowers, establish a rewards for justice program. The last thing I want to talk about is, if I still have time, is the philosophy of engaged parties in Syria. I think currently, for the al-Assad regime, Bashar al-Assad does not see the sanctions as strong enough to compel him to change behavior. And I think that's perfectly understandable. He understands what's at stake. You're basically telling Bashar al-Assad to accept political transition, which will eventually put him out of office, he might end up even killed, in exchange for lifting the sanctions. This doesn't make sense. We need to have a lot more pressure to get al-Assad to agree to those demands. For Assad's backers, they're definitely not happy about these sanctions. They would like to see them lifted as soon as possible so they can recoup some of the investments they had in Syria, so they can benefit from the investments they put into al-Assad regime. But I also think if they believe, if the price is to see al-Assad gone and then a regime that is that works against their interests, then they're not interested in lifting the sanctions. Finally, and most importantly for this panel, I think when you think of Western countries, sanctions have been used more often than not just as a fig leaf. So you don't want to tell the public that you quite simply do not care about what's happening in Syria. You don't want to be Bill Clinton and Rwanda. You don't want to say, I'm not interested in what's happening there. You want to tell them that, no, you're actually doing something, and sanctions are the cheapest alternative for them. You can just put sanctions in place. All you need is maybe 10 public sector employees to enforce them, and that's it. Here you go. You just say, I care about it. And no, don't worry about it. We're actually following all of these Syrian criminals, and they will not go without punishment. But knowing deep down that the current settings do not work, that change will not happen unless we implement some of the recommendations I mentioned.
Karam, thank you so much. I think that was pretty clear, considering it's 3 a.m. in the morning for you. Why don't we move over to Natasha next?
Thank you, Charles, for the invitation, and thank you to Karam and Wael for this paper. There's a lot of data in there that I think will be useful for analysts to unpack, and hopefully we can discuss some of that in the next hour. I actually wanted to center my comments around a mysterious place in Pyongyang, North Korea called Room 39. Located in the depths of the Workers' Party building, Room 39 is a government agency responsible for maintaining access to hard currency, which allows this long-sanctioned regime to reward loyalty and allow the elites to live lives of luxury, while most of the population of 25 million is mired in poverty. And its activities not only include counterfeiting and trafficking in people and drugs, but also showcasing the softer side of the North Korean regime through a kitsch restaurant chain with locations around the world where waitresses sing, dance, and serve you food. And this is my biggest fear when it comes to sanctions, because I would argue that the Syrian regime's Room 39 is already far more sophisticated. Karam called this anti-fragility in his paper, this notion that sanctions over time could make the regime not only resist and recover from sanctions, but actually become stronger because of them. And the victims of many of the Syrian regime's efforts are Syrians themselves. The most obvious Room 39-like activity that we all know about is the Captagon trade, which has devastated the region and ballooned to at least $4 to $6 billion a year, which, as Karam has said in another paper, is twice the Syrian state budget this year. Exploiting forced displacement is another method. While the regime seizes the assets of IDPs, it allows its allies to profit as well. So when Mohammed Hamsho's business interests were hurt by sanctions, he started working with the military's 4th Division to profit from the systematic looting of displaced persons' properties. And his Hadid metal manufacturing company reworks and sells the stolen scrap metal. And this brings in millions in profits every year. And when the sanctions really began to hurt, contacts close to the Syrian military told me that when wheat or rice was particularly scarce, for example, the army used pasta provided by the UN. Soldiers now even eat the high-protein biscuits meant for malnourished children as snacks with their tea. And this is in a country where there are 500,000 chronically malnourished children. But I think what's really going to entrench this regime and normalize it are the seemingly less nefarious ways that they evade sanctions. Because the United Nations doesn't have to abide by EU or US sanctions, they can work with sanctioned actors. So people like Rami Makhlouf and Samer al-Fawz, both sanctioned, benefited from the UN stay in the country in the form of paid services and bills for telecommunication, fuel, food, accommodation, for example. Hamsho and al-Fawz are also primed to take on reconstruction as well, which some US allies and aid agencies are already pushing for. And even Asma al-Assad, another sanctioned actor, has recently established a construction company called Diari. Her organization, the Syria Trust for Development, receives millions in aid from the UN. But it also provides a softer image for the regime, much like North Korea's Room 39 restaurants, but it's far more effective. The Syria Trust was actually recently elected by a UNESCO committee to a world body that protects intangible cultural heritage. So I mean, Karam's paper recognizes that there are many ways that the regime and its allies are learning to evade sanctions, while most Syrians bear the brunt. And as he mentioned, he has several suggestions to adjust sanctions, from expanding the network of sanctioned entities to lifting sectoral sanctions for the release of detainees. But my own view is that the more important adjustment is for sanctioning states to think harder about what they are trying to achieve and what they are willing to do to achieve it. So for example, if the goal is actually political transition or even accountability, sanctioning governments can't just add more sanctioned entities and implement a rewards program to track them. They also need to work with allies to exploit fissures in the regime, as the paper notes, and ensure that these punitive measures are actually effective everywhere. And this is going to involve a lot of very hard discussions and a lot more resources. And it's not clear to me, at least, that this US administration is willing to do that. Now, if the goal is to protect Syrian civilians from the predation of the regime, I don't think the end goal can also just be the release of detainees for lifting all sectoral sanctions. I think that would be wonderful. It's not clear to me that the Syrian regime would actually agree to that. But the other issues are that many of Syria's economic sectors are now controlled by entities like the 4th Division and sanctioned individuals. Such a deal also allows the regime to continue detaining people and extorting those desperate to free their family members. It's essentially the Room 39 gift that keeps giving if it's not addressed. So I think we need to focus more on ensuring that legal protections and assistance get to those who need it as well. And I'm not saying that we don't need to find ways to mitigate the ill effects of sanctions on civilians or, waive them for certain actors. I'm working on this now and I'm happy to share thoughts. But I am saying that we need a sanctions policy that makes sense because it fits into a broader strategy. Now, the North Korean regime has lasted 70 years, most of that time under sanctions. And its people are still hungry, and it's still one of the biggest threats to security in the world. We can't let that happen to Syria. It's going to require, as Karam said, a much bolder strategy and a much more robust diplomatic effort, but it's possible. And so I hope we can get into some of the details of what that could look like in the next hour or so. Thank you, Charles.
Natasha, thank you so much for adding so much to the discussion. Definitely lots of provocative ideas and thoughts to build on as the discussion goes. But why don't we now turn to Jomana for your thoughts?
Yeah, no, thank you, Charles, and thank you, Karam, for putting together a well-written paper with Wael. As you started off, discussing sanctions is a very contentious topic, and I do think, because a lot of the people involved in this conversation, it's sort of a balance between focusing on the Syrian people and making sure that our policies are also not, anti-Assad or we burn the country at the same time, versus, those who want to uphold the regime by any and all, with any cost. So I think it's really constantly a balance between, making sure that we center, I think, for me, as someone who's been involved in the humanitarian efforts for a very long time, the lives of average day Syrians, and making sure that they are not constantly paying the price before, for Bashar al-Assad's crimes, and now as he continues and refuses to give up on power. I want to start off just where Natasha ended, in the sense that, a more robust policy. And I think it's important to mention, as Karam noted in his paper, that, the Syria Accountability and Lebanese Sovereignty Restoration Act of 2003 was, robust sanctions against the regime that was coupled at the time with a very credible threat of force, right? Like the Americans had just invaded Iraq, and Bashar al-Assad really did see and fear that he would be next. And I think in many ways, that's why we did see some modifications in behavior at the time. And it's no secret that the United States is not in a position to offer the same kind of credible threat of force. And so the kind of policies we put forth are just not going to be, the same ones that we've imposed in the past. But taking a sort of a step back on and reflecting on the sanctions regime, I mean, sanctions have been able to do two very important things. I think impede normalization with the regime, which we see different Arab League actors constantly bring up. I think it's vital for the Biden administration to uphold, to their lack of normalizing this actor. And I think the sanctions has helped sort of constantly stigmatize the regime in a way that, not only do you not, you recognize them, you also don't do business with them. And I think it's an important part of that effort. And secondly, preventing any substantial or any real reconstruction aid to make its way to Syria. And I think it's also important to define what reconstruction aid means here, right? Reconstruction, it really should be speaking and focusing on large-scale infrastructure projects, bridges, roads, the Marota project that we saw in the past, expropriating significant amounts of land for this. These are all things that should remain, off the table, I think, for anyone interested in working in Syria. I think, having just been and finished the sort of UN Security Council annual drama that we have come to see every July, we saw this year that something new was added to the resolution, and which was early recovery aid. And I think it's fair to have mixed feelings about this concept, right? Of one, we understand that there is deep donor fatigue. We're watching this happen, in Afghanistan, that the U.S. is sort of pulling back, reassessing where its budget is being allocated towards. And even though I think humanitarian aid funding is really a drop in the bucket for the United States, as more domestic pressures, mount on for domestic reform here, healthcare, et cetera, you're going to see that foreign aid be sort of the target of questioning, and people are going to wonder why money is constantly going overseas when it should be going here. And so I agree. Natasha, you and I have discussed a lot about the role of the United Nations and the many harms, that sort of the UN's activity has caused within Syria, and the lack of real accountability. But since early recovery has been included in the resolution, I think what would be helpful at this point, as we talk about sanctions, is if the United States is going to send money to the United Nations anyway, ensuring that money going to early recovery is, for example, being focused on refurbishing of schools, focusing it on children so that they aren't on the receiving end of, while we sort of reassess the policy and the sanctions policy we have, is that if our money is going to continue to going to Syria to fund UN activities, that there should be more, follow-up on where that money is going. Addressing, for example, water pipes, et cetera, those things that people find questionable. Is that going to leave Syrians, everyday Syrians, with, better access to life, frankly? And so if that money is being sent, how do we spend it? And then finally, two last things. I know right now that the administration is doing a global sanctions review, and there's, looking at Iran sanctions, Syria sanctions, North Korea sanctions, all kinds of sanctions imposed across the world. And there's a lot of things that the administration can consider, as it sort of reflects on this. We know that, there wasn't really a great, in terms of looking at what companies are being sanctioned, finding mechanisms for those who are being, are suffering from being wrongly sanctioned, being able to pick up the phone and call someone at state or treasury and say, our company is being, it's part of the unforeseen consequences of sanctions. We've asked many times the administration, both the two previous administrations, for more specific guidance memos for banks on the humanitarian side. And then I also really very much endorse the things that Karam recommended, which is incentives for whistleblowers, and looking critically at that as a tool to sort of enhance our sanctions regime, including, as you mentioned, Karam, offering asylum for people who, may be able to help us in that regard. And then finally, I just wanted to end with something that Natasha did mention, and that's narco-terrorism. The street value of Captagon, we know in 2020 was at least $3.5 billion, which is 5 times the value of the country's legitimate exports. This is obviously being pocketed by the Assad regime. And the loyalists who control the manufacturing plants, the underground laboratories, export facilities. Syria has plenty of land that is excellent for the cultivation of this, and it has been critical for providing all kinds of revenue that the Syrian regime is unable to get by in any legal, through formal or even informal means. I mean, this has offered a whole new sort of way of revenue. I would say in this case, though, the Kingpin Act is probably more appropriate than the Caesar Act, and this is going to involve, more successful coordination between the interagency DEA, DOJ, DOD, Treasury, Commerce, as well as multilateral cooperation, as Natasha mentioned. So it's really, I think it offers us an opportunity to work better with allies on issues that I think are of common threat to everyone, not just in the region, but even beyond, especially in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera. So all in there, this is just some of my brief thoughts on Karam's paper and the sanctions in general. Thanks, Charles.
Jomana, thank you so much. Lots more to add to the discussion, so thank you. Andrew, you're up next.
Great. Well, Charles, first to you and MEI, thank you for putting this together and for supporting Karam's paper. I thought it was excellent, and I've spent the last few days on vacation thinking about it. It wasn't just because it raised interesting questions, but it raised interesting questions about the job that I just left in government. Myself and a few others, most notably Matthew Zweig of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, were advisors on Syria policy and on sanctions. And we discussed, I would say, nearly all of the issues that you raised on a regular basis over time, and that discussion led to a lot of thinking, and I just want to say, to start out with, that I think the recommendations are excellent. I'm going to go through them. I'm actually going to do something. As a matter of just preference, I actually like to comment on what people have written because I think you spend a lot of time actually writing it. But I will make an initial, I'll give you an initial vignette. About 10 years ago, when the Syrian uprising was in fully in the streets, and the United States was struggling for what to do, and this would be a little over 10 years ago, I was hauled into a office in the State Department with a very senior official, along with two other friends, and the discussion started. And I've been working on Syria for a long time, as many of you know. And the discussion started like this. The official asked me, "Okay, Andrew, what do we do?" I raised the point that Karam raises in the paper, and that is Syrian energy exports were overwhelmingly to Western Europe. I think they were actually far in excess of the 80% you mentioned. If you take it all in all, I think it was almost close to 95% because of Syrian crude being heavy and sour, and you have to have refineries tuned to that, and Western European refineries are tuned for that. And I said to them, well, we can very easily with allies shut off the exports of Syrian oil to Western Europe. But the problem is that the regime, by its clientelistic, minority-based regime, won't go without a kick. At a certain point, you're going to have to give it a kick, and a kick meant a military kick. And the official said to me, okay, write this down, which I did. And like all good policy discussions, and this is the way policy works, politicians take one part of what you recommend and disregard the other. And unfortunately, in the case of Syria, we were unable to politically deal and develop a strategy all these years until actually today that would effectively deal with the challenges of the Assad regime, a minority-based clientelistic regime that unfortunately has morphed into something, as Natasha raised, and as I seriously believe now, has emerged as a kind of North Korea in the Mediterranean. What was interesting about that experience was that my very first day in the White House, and this was an unclassified discussion, I was in a room and we were discussing Syria, and I asked a group of people, if you were just getting my job as the Syria director and you wanted to change the regime's behavior, what would you do? And they said to me, well, how do you feel about using military force? And I said, well, I really don't know. It would depend on the situation. And they said, well, military force works very effectively with regimes like the Assad's, but it's only for a while. And we actually have found that in the case of chemical weapons use and a number of other behaviors. But again, it has almost a shelf life. Sanctions, as I would argue, are where the real long-term game is on Syria. I don't think you can deal with a regime that's morphed in this way without the use of military force in one way, shape, or form, but sanctions get you where it is you want to go. And I think that unless we develop that sanction strategy, and I argued that recently, with the full support of, but not only, also in the open source, which I think this paper is an excellent contribution of and analysis of, we're going to be stuck with this rickety regime and all the different criminal activities that it has begun to carry out. Jomana mentioned Captagon, but not only, for decades to come. And I don't want that, because I think that the longer this goes on, the longer we ignore this problem, the longer the Syrian people are going to suffer. So with that in mind, very quickly, I'll go through your recommendations. First of all, you're right that the EU relied on sanctions a lot more than the US did, especially earlier in the conflict. That's largely because there were more European touch points to the Syrian economy. The US doesn't trade substantially with Syria. But not only that, the EU sanctions rely on unclassified evidence, and the US sanctions are more rigorous for a variety of reasons that I can't really get into. So sanctions packages for the US take longer, but they have more staying power. And certainly you discovered inaccuracies. I'm not surprised by that. That happens. Government policy is a social and political exercise, and people make mistakes. But it also, remember that this all has to square against other sources of information, classified and unclassified, that perhaps the general public doesn't have privy to. And so it's just important to keep that in mind. The ultimate goal of sanctions is behavior change that addresses injustice. I couldn't agree with you more, but that is actually not that is a policy reason. It is not the legal reason why sanctions, the reason why sanctions exist is to protect the American economy and the EU marketplace from the criminal activities and these individuals who are carrying out these illegal activities and that are deemed as a threat to the national security of those countries or those associations. And so there is a conflict between the evidence-based packages that you develop and the actual policy goals. And over time, and as you're right, and Natasha raised this, that has evolved into that. And I think it's something that's natural. And I think it's something that, given the size of the American economy in particular, but not only that, the European economy and combined as an alliance, it's very important. You're right that we only got into as a tip of the iceberg. Absolutely. And especially with secondary sanctions, that's where a lot of work needs to be done. And that is something that we all need to keep abreast of and coordinate better on. As Syria's gotten more confusing, coordination has become harder and harder. The sectoral-based sanctions, in terms of your recommendations, scrapping all of them, I don't think that's realistic. I think it would depend on the sector, and it would depend on for what reason. I think instead, probably in the early game here, we're going to be talking about licenses, export licenses, and expedited licenses in particular. But in the long term, you're right. There are certain sanctions, I think, that do hit the economy and the general Syrian public more severely. We need to address that. My main argument has been, and it was edited out of a recent piece I wrote just for space reasons, that we need to look at these sanctions more as switches and knobs on a dashboard and not like a hammer. I think that will do no one any justice. The sticks and carrots argument. This is something we talked about every day when I was in government, and it was a great experience. The Ambassador Jeffrey's team was top notch. We used to talk about how and where to push people within the regime every day. And unless we deal with the internal dynamics of the regime, especially in its core, it's important to point that out, we won't have a hope in hell of changing their behavior. However, as you point out, these networks are enormously important because of the way they funnel profits to the regime. And the regime is something that is independent of the state. In terms of the sectoral sanctions, one of my colleagues pointed out that a lot of these sectoral sanctions, it's hard not to have government touch points given the degree of government involvement and regime involvement. But we can get into that debate a little bit later. So overall, I would agree with your targeting of the networks of the regime. The Rewards for Justice program, excellent idea. We developed it for some figures in Lebanon, but we need to expand it. And we need to definitely involve more local organizations. The problem is not information anymore on Syria, and I'll end with this. When I first started working on Syria 20 years ago, there weren't a whole lot of people that worked on policy on Syria. It was a pretty small group of people. Now we're absolutely swimming in information. The problem is sorting it out and weighing it out and determining what it is that we can move forward with, and then convincing politicians to do something about it. And I think we've got a long way to go with this administration. I don't think that they are focused on it. I think that they are doubtful of the impact of sanctions, but it's pretty early in the game. The rapid withdrawal strategy in Afghanistan has hit major problems, and that could affect the American military posture and sanctions posture across the world. So with that, I'll end and hand it back over. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much, and thank you to all four of you for your opening remarks. I think you've thrown a lot out into the air to consider for the rest of the discussion. I'll come to you first, Karam, with a sort of very 100,000 square foot question, sort of almost philosophical one. But when you said very clearly, and I think you're largely right, it's impossible to establish causality. And I think your words were, we all need to be humble. I guess part of me thinks, having, listened in on, been involved in lots of discussions with policymakers on Syria over the years, sanctions have often seemed like, and Andrew can certainly correct me about whether or not this is the reality, but certainly the perception has often been that sanctions are sort of an afterthought. It's like, oh yeah, sanctions, we'll keep sanctions on, but let's talk about something else. Sanctions are kind of a given. We'll keep that part of the policy. We'll keep that going. That's the status quo bit. But of course, from a sort of public messaging perspective, no administration that wants to make change in Syria can say we can't establish causality and we have to be humble. Of course, they have to project a more cohesive, more powerful line on sanctions. And I just wondered, kind of very, very big picture, how do you square that circle as someone like yourself, a political economist, who sees all of the technicalities, but then also you're a Syrian. No doubt you want Syria to see better days, and presumably that involves some form of change from the situation we're in today. How do you square that circle of seeing sanctions as being of use, but equally we have no way, in your words at least, of knowing for sure that they are working in which directions? I'm just trying to sort of square that circle. I realize that's a tricky question, but you brought it on yourself.
Look, I think we can all agree that economies and political systems are just living organisms, which means that when you hit them with multiple shocks, they react to each of them at the same time and at different time horizons, which means that it's nearly impossible for you to identify the impact of a certain shock on that country or that economy. And so what this means to me is most junior analysts tend to be fascinated by models, tend to be fascinated by numbers and regressions and so on, but for the wrong reason. Models, like trying to understand the impact of sanctions using models is just a fruitless effort. I really don't think we should be doing it. Now, what's the alternative? The alternative, I believe, should be best judgment. Now, we all know that your judgment, sometimes you can come up with a judgment without even being able to justify it. So like, think of heuristic judgments. Think of Kahneman's book, for example, on someone being like a fireman trying to extinguish fire and then deciding all of a sudden to leave the house. And when people were asking him, why did you leave? You were in the middle of extinguishing that fire. He said, I don't know, it just felt right. And then the house crumbled. It turned out that there was fire actually underneath, and he was feeling the heat. He didn't know how to justify that judgment. So all I'm saying here is we should actually respect this kind of judgments, even if we cannot justify them fully. Finally, I just want to say, you talked about me being Syrian. I think you're absolutely right. I have my own biases. I think we're humans. We all have biases. The question is, how biased are we? How well can we deal with these biases, and how good we are at understanding our own biases, So of course, Western analysts have their own biases, but I'd love to hear what they think, because they have better perspective when it comes to different things. I don't know if this answers your question, but yeah.
It's definitely a good try. I realize it's almost an impossible question to ask, but I was interested in your take. Natasha, you raised Captagon, which is definitely an issue that seems to be, acquiring a little bit more traction in people's minds over the last 6 months. And just to sort of, remove my moderator's hat for 5 seconds, and I would say, that 3.5 billion number, of course, is only the Captagon that was seized last year. So, God knows how much more got through. So we really are talking about an absolutely enormous industry in terms of, comparisons to the scale of the Syrian economy, at least the legitimate economy. But I certainly have had, discussions with policymakers, particularly in Europe, about Captagon in the last few months. And what struck me is that those coming from the more security side of government, more on the intelligence and military side, national security, they're particularly worried because they think that this has, domestic repercussions. This isn't just about Syria and the war in Syria anymore. This is an international organized crime sort of network of an enormous scale. So I just wonder if I could throw a question to you, which may or may not relate to sanctions, but I assume it has certainly a relation, which is this a whole new dynamic that could make Syria policy A, more relevant, but B, also open windows for other kinds of measures that we haven't traditionally been used to talking about with regards to either resolving the Syrian crisis or containing the effects of it. And as I say, I assume sanctions could be part of that discussion, but perhaps it's wider. And I partly raise this to you as well because, of course, North Korea plays a very similar role in its own neighborhood.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I don't mean to be a Captagon or a drug trafficking expert, but I don't think it's just drugs that are going to be the problem in the future, right? We're talking about foreign fighters potentially. If the regime takes over the Northeast, it will have access to a whole camp where there's, fighters as well. We're talking about arms trafficking. We're talking about human trafficking, drug trafficking. I mean, this is going to be a source of regional and potentially global instability for the foreseeable future. We already know that Hezbollah's network is worldwide and incredibly destabilizing all around the world. So yes, certainly I think that this is a reason, one of the many reasons in my opinion, to take Syria seriously. Obviously I am somewhat biased to the humanitarian catastrophe that has happened in Syria, but we all need to be taking this much, much more seriously because we now see basically a string of disasters from Afghanistan, a clear line all the way to the Mediterranean right now. So how are opportunists going to take advantage of that? They already have taken advantage of that, but I think we're really in the nascent stage of that right now. And you see Jordan, you see Saudi Arabia, you see others already grappling with the Captagon issue and wondering if it's such a great idea, I think, to open their doors to Syria at this point. But I think we're already in that space. That said, I think that this is a way to talk to those actors more seriously about having a much more constructive policy when it comes to Syria, when it comes to the above board economy, but when it also comes to these more nefarious activities and how to track the actors that are actually controlling them. And I mentioned that this is, fuel for the regime. And that's exactly what we've seen. So before it was fueling both sides of the conflict, but since the regime has consolidated more territory, it's also consolidated this Captagon trade as well. So we do know that it's strengthening the regime. And as you correctly noted, it was only $3.5 billion street value in the Gulf, not to get too technical, that was captured last year. So it's potentially much, much larger than that. And so I think that we really need to think about that because that really also mitigates the actual effects of sanctions. And again, we're just at the beginning. If the regime starts getting into cryptocurrencies and a lot of the other things that Karam talked about in his paper, we're going to see a much, I would actually argue with Andrew Tabler's point that the long-term effects of sanctions, increase. I think my point is that they could actually decrease as the regime figures out more ways, more avenues around them. And those ways, I fear, are potentially even more destabilizing. But I do think it provides an avenue to bring this as an issue of greater importance to regional actors, but also the U.S. administration, because they really need to take this seriously, because I think it can go beyond the drug trade. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I think so, definitely, and definitely adds to the discussion. I don't know, Andrew, I think you seem to pivot towards maybe responding. Did you want to say something in response to that?
Yeah, first of all, I agree with Natasha. As I mentioned earlier, I think the problem, it was a saying on the Hill, of course, it was before the JCPOA agreement was formed and then done away with, and then who knows what's going to happen next. But so there was a saying on Capitol Hill when I first arrived in Washington: sanctions are an elevator that only goes up. That's not true. They can go back down, as we saw in the JCPOA. I'm arguing something different, and I think Natasha is right. The fact is, the longer that we use the hammer and that we use it in a stupid way, the better the regime is going to be able to get around it, because the longevity of the regime is encompasses decades, and our election cycles are every 4 to 8 years. So what we need to do is look at these sanctions, I think, creatively, and we need to look at it as switches and knobs on a dashboard. I think the idea of creating incentives to lead people away from the regime and the core of the regime, or at least the networks, is an excellent idea, but you have to dangle it out. You have to develop the carrots. We're not very good at that. There are a lot of reasons for it. Large amount has to do with how our government is structured. So the fact that we don't have a senior Syria envoy that is able to reach across the bureaucracy and to attend NSC meetings, to be able to understand about how to focus policy and to get things done, how to work out problems between the State Department and Treasury, and so on. Without these kind of things, we're not going to have an ability to throw switches and knobs and turn knobs. Instead, what we're going to do, and unfortunately, I think we're on the way to, we could be on the way to doing it, is that we're on the way to just lifting things, or just implementing something that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And that's not going to do us any good. It's not going to do the Syrian people any good, because they're suffering. And the longer that we're not creative, the longer that we don't focus on this, the worse it's going to get. There are people who argue against sanctions. Steve Simon, Josh Landis would be among them. But in all my discussions with over the years with Steve Simon, for example, he does so not, I think, because he loves the regime, but quite because he lived through the Iraq experience. He saw how the Iraqi people suffered. He knows how our government functions, and he doesn't think we can do any better. Now, I'm of course putting words in his mouth, but that's a real problem. That's a real bureaucratic problem that we need to address. And I think until we do, we're not going to have a hope of having this succeed.
Well, and then if I could just jump in here, Charles,
yeah.
Building off of what Andrew said, at the same time, removing sanctions without getting anything in return is also very difficult to do, right? Even for the credibility of the United States, for what this signals to future regimes. I mean, I'm forgetting now, I think it was in Hungary, I'm forgetting, but there was a politician who was using Syria as an example of, like, if we just wait long enough, the West will lose interest in trying to effect positive change. I'm not sure if it was Hungary, but I remember there was a right-wing demagogue who was speaking, and I believe it was Hungary, but the idea is that Syria is already an example, and I think all of us here would love nothing more than to remove sanctions off of Syria to allow the Syrian people to go back to live normal lives. I have extended family there. I think many of us know people who have been impacted by this, but removing them and getting nothing in return, I think, is not only not just meeting the goals of our own policy goals, but it could be incredibly detrimental for the future of the Syrian people. So it's really stuck between a rock and a hard.
So Jomana, just to tack onto that, this was a question I was actually going to ask you anyway, but I think it makes sense given what you just said. I mean, as someone who has a hand very solidly in the humanitarian aid space, and extensive, through that extensive awareness and engagement with the population in an opposition-controlled region of the country, given all of those sort of dilemmas, the awareness that sanctions are inevitably going to affect the civilian population, whether that's the purpose or not, is kind of irrelevant. But of course, there's a knock-on effect. What's your general impression been, and maybe this can just be your personal opinion rather than an analytical one, but what's your general opinion or position, impression of how Syrians inside the country who still support any effort against the regime actually perceive Western sanctions? I mean, is there just an unquestioned support for sanctions policy? Is it much more nuanced than that? Or is there, dare I say it, beginning to be concern or opposition to sanctions policy? I'm just interested in your view on that. And of course, anyone else on the panel who might want to chime in on the same question.
Sure. I mean, this is I haven't conducted any official surveys, but from everything that I've read, I mean, obviously Syrians are very divided on this issue. In Idlib, probably the impression is much more clear, given that they are not really on the receiving end of the worst of the sanctions regime. Of course, remittances, even humanitarian organizations are impacted in their ability to send money. And people here find it difficult to send money to any parts of Syria, including Idlib, including Northeast, because of the sanctions regime. But many of them, because they're not, under the influence of, I would say, the regime and the resistance axis propaganda efforts, they are able to, see and understand that, it is really the regime's stubbornness and reluctance to, not just reluctance, but to, its full, rejection of any desire to change anything in its system that has really led to a sanctions regime that is worse every year than it was the year prior. But within the regime-held areas, listen, I do give many people credit there that they do also look at this in a nuanced way, right? Because as Natasha noted, that even when UN funds make its way over there, when the regime and Russia, as sort of the regime's lawyer, successfully gains access to more humanitarian aid, that aid is not going to the average Syrian person, and it goes instead to help with many of the militias, the soldiers that are recruited, that are basically a mercenary force, right? Either for Iranian-backed forces, Russian-backed forces, or regime-backed forces, and they're also seeing that those who are continually enriched do tend to be the same, or elite classes, let's not say the same, because obviously that elite class has changed over the last 10 years, but it is a preferred class of citizens that are very close to the regime, the patronage networks. And so, I think, give Syrians credit, they do really understand that even when this money is making its way into Syria, it's not going to offset the daily lives of Syrians. I mean, I think it was in Karam's previous report that he wrote for us at the Atlantic Council, where he noted that it was, I think the average Syrian needs about $304 per month to survive. And they're bringing home, around $25, the average public sector employee. And they know that, from the new budget that the Syrian regime, has that made public, it's a, 1/3 of what the Syrian regime used to give, even though the population has been halved. And so they do see that. They do see that the regime is not able to really sustain that support from the Iranians, from the Russians, the way it claimed. And so I would say that, yeah, the opinions of Syrians is diverse. But of course, like I said, the resistance axis is very strong in its propaganda efforts to blame this solely on the United States, and to put it really on us that this is.
Great. Does anyone else want to chime in there? Karam, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the region. What we can say is that sanctions have definitely hurt everyone within the country. They didn't have to live in regime-held areas. However, the magnitude of the impact is completely different. So people in regime-held areas are affected a lot more. But you can think of people also in opposition-held areas where they can't work online, for instance, join Upwork community and do online work, make real good money. Google Suite products stop there. So people's perceptions have also been affected by the genuine negative impact they had by those sanctions. But here I can perhaps maybe talk a little bit about some polling we did with the Operations and Policy Center. So we tried to ask people about their perceptions or their, I think I have here the exact wording in front of me. So give me a sec. So we were asking people, in your opinion, what's the main driver of the Syrian pound depreciation? And this was done in 2020, where there was severe depreciation. Actually, 23.8% in northeast Syria, so in areas outside regime control, thought that the Caesar Act was the main reason, thought that the Caesar Act was the primary reason. Now, what I want to say here is really important. What people think is not necessarily true, but not only people, Bashar al-Assad himself. So when Bashar al-Assad says that the Caesar Act is not the main reason and the banking crisis that we had in Lebanon is actually much more significant, who's there to say that Bashar al-Assad actually knows what he's saying? What I can tell you is When we used to receive parliamentary questions, when I used to work for the New Zealand Treasury, the Minister of Finance would ask, can you tell me what's the impact of this on that? What's the role of this factor? And quite often the answer is, I don't know. We don't know. We don't understand how economies work. So we just made guesses.
Sorry, can I just jump into the Northwest part? So I've been talking with people in the Northwest, and as Karam says, this is, or as Jomana says as well, this isn't, a formal poll or anything like that. But I think that they do recognize that sanctions affect them less than it does, their relatives or their friends in regime-controlled areas. But I also want to mention something that we're not talking about, which is counterterrorism measures, which really do affect the Northwest and will substantially affect the Northwest if UN cross-border is not renewed next year, because the UN is allowed to work in spaces where HTS is present. So that will significantly impede aid and the economy in the Northwest. But I think that, we need to, again, as Karam says, we need to sort of parse this out, be humble about how much causation we can actually show. The Northwest also uses other currencies. So it uses the Turkish currency is being, Turkish lira is also being used in the Northwest. So I think this is part of the reason that we need to be a lot more granular in what we're talking about. There are very different types of sanctions, and there's different ways to leverage them, as Andrew said, using it sort of as knobs and instead of a sledgehammer, I think is really important here.
Got it. And I think you're absolutely right, Natasha. Andrew, speaking of Andrew, I have a question for you. Which hopefully, I'm sure I probably asked you this several times while you were in government, but and never really got an answer for understandable reasons. But perhaps now you're out, I will. So I'll give it another go. The Caesar Act, as has been said today, is that the Caesar Act is designed in part, at least, or it helps or should help to impede regime normalization. And obviously, we've seen that challenged in a number of kind of waves over the last couple of years, and we've certainly had one in recent months. A lot of speculation surrounding the visit of King Abdullah here and what kind of message he was conveying. But I guess my question to you is, in part, given your experience in government, and by all means, you don't have to refer to that if you're not in a position to, but broadly speaking, how much are we actually capable of using Caesar to stop rather than to deter normalization? Is this a matter of us having to say what the State Department has said on many occasions, which is, well, we would remind our allies in the region that we have the Caesar Act? But ultimately speaking, is the US really going to sanction an ally if they choose to take that subsequent step and cross the line? Or really, is this just kind of like a we can only really warn and then severely warn, but ultimately there's not much we can do? I wonder if I could get your position on that.
Sure. So these things, first of all, Caesar drives up sanctions risk substantially because of the secondary nature of them. But not only, it's also the scope of the activities, the fact that they deal with regime atrocities. It's the one thing that the regime really can't get out of because of the pile of evidence and so on. And all Syrians know how brutal their regime is, and that's not something that's going to change anytime soon. So, then it's very interesting. You do have this recent. Apparently, there's a roadmap by King Abdullah, which has not been seen publicly, that deals with normalizing, or at least getting out of this situation with the regime and allowing them to trade or trade across Syria. And so on. So we can deter that. What any party is going to want, whether they're an ally, and we don't give them to adversaries, but to allies, they're going to want a sanctions license, and they're going to want a broad one, and they're going to want one that gets them out of jail, and sanctions that work. We did that sometimes during the Trump administration. Delta Crescent Energy in northeast Syria was one example. But they could do this again. That's a political decision, whether they want to go after the degree do they want to go after Emirati or Jordanian companies for trading. But a lot of these things, I think we have an ability to deter it. I think we have an ability to shape it, to completely stop it. Well, it doesn't stop smuggling. It doesn't stop a lot of illicit activities, but it forces people all over the world to make a choice. and any entity that supports them. Do you want to risk your relationship with the global community and all your touch points in order to trade some stuff to the Syrian sphere, to regime-controlled areas, but not only? And it drives up that risk. And there is an ability to shape it, I think. The problem is the speed with which we can do that. I think it's hard to do that. You could issue licenses that were focused, for example, on water pipes. There are some legitimate humanitarian activities that could be licensed. But does that cover the whole scope of activities that the Jordanians want? Well, it depends on what the roadmap outlines. Depends on what the Emiratis roadmap outlines. I strongly suspect it's something much larger. Electricity, gas, some of the things that have recently come out in the press. But not only, I think they look to larger, broader horizons. I don't think that's going to be likely. I think the most likely scenario are increased licenses. Probably because for as much as this administration might want to allow it, to see what the Arabs could get with it from the regime, there is overwhelming bipartisan support for the Caesar sanctions. They're the rare exception during the Trump administration that everyone virtually agreed on. That's a hard political fact and a rare one in this political environment.
Karam, you have your hand up.
Just very quickly on the Caesar Act, I think it was great to have the Caesar Act, and it's the fact that it introduces secondary sanctions is extremely useful. However, this act is likely to use its usefulness as we just keep threatening with it without actually using it. If you go to OFAC's website and try to search for people who have been sanctioned under the Caesar Act, then you will see actually only 4, one of whom is dead. And all 4 are Syrian nationals. So people who you could have actually sanctioned under previous executive orders. The difference of sanctioning them, at least from an operational perspective, under the Caesar Act or under executive orders would be virtually non-existent. The impact is on foreign investors. So here's where you scare them and you tell them, because these are secondary sanctions, I can sanction you even if your behavior is not sanctionable, just because you have proven ties with people who are involved. The final point I want to make here is that the amount of evidence required for sanctioning someone under the Caesar Act is considerably higher than like the evidence you need for sanctioning someone under an executive order, which meant that, especially because of COVID, many US officials actually did not have the time and the resources to compile all of that evidence to sanction individuals under the Caesar Act. Now, I think we should use it much more. We should use it a lot more, especially the secondary sanctions feature, for it not to lose effectiveness.
Sorry, Charles, may I just add one thing? And I was just messaging with my former colleague, Matt Zweig, and we argued for this in government. This is the reason why we need an implementing executive order concerning Caesar. Karam pointed out, remember that this was all implemented not only during the middle of a very divisive political time and administration, but we implemented it during the beginning of the pandemic. And so we had to make Caesar stick with existing executive orders. We argued otherwise. We still need one. I think it will make things more specific and it will make things more calibrated.
Great, Andrew, thank you. So we have one, I guess, slightly hostile question, but I think it raises something that is probably worth, I guess, entertaining. Essentially, the message and the question is: Are we really here discussing what's best for the Syrian people, or are we just trying to find a better way of toppling the regime? So let me kind of translate that into a more constructive question and say, we have two paths that Western policy can take. We can choose to accept that the regime is here to stay and drop everything and go back to other issues, or we can sustain this status quo approach and find a better way. Which of those approaches, in each of your opinion, because perhaps I can ask you all, is most likely to lead, short and long term, to something that is better for Syria's people? Keep sanctions, or are the sanctions in and of themselves having such a either unmeasurable impact or a negative impact or both, that the Western governments should consider removing them step by step or altogether. So turning a slightly hostile question into a semi-constructive one. And, whoever wants to go first, who's going to be the lucky one to go first? Natasha?
Charles. I mean, I would just, all right, let me breathe deeply before I answer that question. I think that there's a lot of people that want to feel like what happened in Syria is a natural disaster. And that's the issue. And all we have to do is put lots of money into reconstruction and everything will be fine. Demographic reengineering is ongoing, right? Arrests are ongoing. I just talked to someone the other day. He said 2 of his employees in the aid organization in Damascus, they later found out were killed in detention somewhere. It didn't end there. So they got rent. They rented out places for their family members because they no longer had a source of income. A security committee that's linked to the government's aid organizations knocked on their door and said, you have a week to get out or you're going to be arrested. They had to get out. They had to be evacuated. This is ongoing. This isn't a hurricane that hit Syria, right? There's a reason that refugees can't return. Reconstruction is about more than just infrastructure. It's about human resources. So I'm not against reconstruction. Do reconstruction. But the reconstruction that we have seen, and it is ongoing, is in areas that don't really need reconstruction. And we've seen this time and time again with every city in Syria that the regime has retaken. So we've seen this in Aleppo, we've seen it at Homs, we've seen it in Rif Dimeshq, we've seen it all over. And now there's recently another regional planning edict that has said that the coast will be a priority for planning. This is an area that has not been affected, at least in terms of infrastructure, over the course of the war. So I think we need to do a broader audit of where even just humanitarian aid is going right now, because as far as I can tell in the research that I've done, it's not getting to people in need. So we can start there as a basis. And I think we need to start there as a basis because otherwise we're just entrenching injustice. I think a lot of people hope that if you lift sanctions, everything will just get better. And I'm saying that it's not. It's not going to get better unless we get really concrete, tangible wins for the Syrian people. And that's going to take a lot more, frankly, a robust diplomatic effort, as I said, or at least, we could start with a Syrian envoy, as Andrew mentioned, as a start, at least to show people that we're serious. Because right now we're just painting on more sanctions. And my biggest fear is that our actual policy is going to get buried underneath these slogans. These slogans, amongst them being no political transition or no reconstruction without political transition, no lifting of sanctions without political transition. But then underneath all of that, reconstruction slowly starts happening. Funds start coming in. There are sanctions exemptions or sanctions licenses, as Andrew pointed out. And this reminds me of Resolution 242 in Palestine, where we said we were going to solve this problem. We were going to end the illegal occupation. And it just never happened because we didn't take it seriously. And we just kept reciting 242, 242. I don't want the same thing to happen to Syria.
Thanks, Natasha. Anyone else want to take that on, or shall I move ahead for another question?
Well, I would, I think that what this administration, I think in terms of a stated policy destination, right, is I think what we're, as of right now, 2254 is still the policy on the table. But if it's not, it would be, I think everyone, both U.S. policymakers here and the Syrian people want to know, to what end are we imposing these measures? And because I don't think they'll be helpful otherwise. And as many of us have already said, is that the sanctions regime alone will not bring about change. Bashar al-Assad is going nowhere just due to these sanctions. If he was, there were points in the last 10 years where he was much more, under much more existential threat than he is today. And he didn't budge. So I think that those facts we need to look at them in the face, because it's not something that makes anyone, I think, who stands up for democracy and freedom feel good, but that's the reality. And so what are we doing with these measures? I think we owe it to ourselves as American policymakers and the people we impose them upon. And I think that that's something that I hope that the administration is looking critically at. I would also just say that that if, looking at offsetting what the impact of those sanctions on local people is important. I think there's been a lot of papers written here and there that have not been given enough attention, right? But the Syrian people in many areas, for example, that were under siege for years, we see this in Daraa now, and I mean, there's been obviously areas in the suburbs of Damascus, et cetera, where there were areas that were under siege for many years. They learned to, for example, produce their own agriculture, they, run their own projects, their own community building. A lot of Syrians have learned to govern themselves because the government was missing. Now, I think that there is room to think about what can be achieved with people who have survived that kind of self-governance. I don't have an answer, but I think it's worth thinking about, that I think would help us think about if sanctions are going to continue to be imposed, what things can we do to offset the impact of the sanctions on the average people, which, as you stated in the very beginning, or I believe it was Natasha, I'm not sure who is something, is a goal of this administration, is to making sure that this isn't another Iraq in the 90s, right? So how can we, put average Syrian people sort of at the heart of this, the heart of this policy, and coupling it with other things, like looking at the role of local organizations or local charities, like the accountability measures, right? Not putting all the pressure solely on sanctions, but pursuing the criminals that have fled Syria into Europe, asset seizing, those kinds of things. I know from the beginning in 2011, we were looking at, back then, some of us as lawyers, looking at asset seizures in the United States. It hasn't led anywhere, but looking at secondary individuals that have been involved in this and asset seizing. And I think that there's room definitely to be creative without putting all the pressure solely on just sanctioning sectors. And instead trying to identify, pinpoint the real people responsible for what's happened in Syria.
Karam, you have your hand up. So just before you delve into that, I also have a question for you, which you can sort of tack on to your comments that follow. This question is about how the deterioration of the Syrian pound seems to have been somewhat brought under control over the last few months after an unprecedented fall last year. What are the reasons for this sort of stagnation / sort of steady recovery, given that sanctions remain in place and the banking sector in Lebanon only continues to collapse?
Yeah, so regarding the first question, I think like inherent in that comment was like a dichotomous view of the sanctions. So do we keep them or lift them? I just don't understand, why would you ever lift sanctions that are targeted in nature? Why would you remove asset freezes and travel bans on people who have indeed committed human rights violations? So I think what Natasha was trying to say is, we should try to get US policymakers and like Western politicians to care more. To me, to be honest, I feel like we just can't do that. We might have lost it. They have many other priorities. We cannot influence their priorities on Syria. I think we should be now thinking, given the fact that Western allies do not really care about what's happening in Syria, except for the fig leaf that is trying to act as what's happening in Syria is really important to them. I think we need to be thinking, what can we do as Syrians, or as people who care about Syria? You don't have to be Syrian. What can we do to work with Syrians within the country? I think our chances of changing the situation would be a lot higher if we took this approach. Now, regarding the question, I think this actually touches on what Andrew said earlier, in that sanctions work a lot better over time. I actually do not really agree with that. It depends on the sanctions. It depends on how frequently you're reviewing them. So for instance, when the Biden administration took office, they simply left the sanctions without any revisions, which meant that the Syrian regime was able to create multiple loopholes in them and exploit them. That's the nature of sanctions. That's life. It's the game between a mouse and a cat. So you have to keep chasing them and closing these loopholes. That's why it's a continuous process. What happened was the Syrian regime was able to exploit some new channels, and that's how they managed to stabilize the exchange rate. We also need to bear in mind that what happened over 2020 was just exceptionally bad for the Syrian regime. The sanctions were only one factor. You had the pandemic, for example. You had the banking crisis in Lebanon, and so on and so forth.
Charles,
Brilliant.
can I just
thank you? Yes.
Can I just
go
add
for
to
it,
that?
Andrew.
So, first of all, I agree with Karam about this. I look at this a little different. I'm looking at this in sanctions in terms of pressure. I think that they're chronic pressure, whereas military forces I began with is more of an acute sort of tool. But I agree with you. Sanctions, like all policy, needs to be maintained. If you don't maintain it in the sense of improving it, fine-tuning it, trying to see what's going on and move in a certain direction, it becomes very easy for these tyrannical regimes to move around them because their forms of government last over decades. And so it becomes a real problem and not an easy one to overcome.
Brilliant, thank you. And Andrew, just before we go to, because we've got 10 minutes left, before we go to a sort of quick fire, where I think I'll pose you all a couple of questions to pick from. Andrew, there's a question for you here. Was the issuance of an OFAC license for Delta Crescent an example of your knobs and buttons on a dashboard approach? The questioner says this was certainly a novel approach to the broader sanctions issue. And if so, do you think it was a mistake not to renew the license?
Yeah, so that's actually an excellent question. It is, I think the issuance of that license was a creative solution. So yes, I guess it could fall within knobs and switches. That was not my call, but it certainly could be included in that. I had two problems with that license not being renewed. One was that what we were trying to do, this was not about Trump stealing the oil. I realize a lot of critics say that. And of course, there is rhetoric in every administration. We're hearing that from the Biden administration right now. What we were trying to do was to use Syrian resources to help Syrians in Northeast Syria in particular, to use these resources towards early recovery activities and other kinds of stabilization. We were also trying to get them to stop trading oil with the regime, where the refining is overwhelmingly in the western part of Syria, and also to stop using the crude, what they call stills in eastern Syria, which are incredibly environmentally destructive. So we thought it was a win-win-win, I think. And now there's the reality of something, and then there's the politics of it. My point is twofold. One is, well, if we're not going to renew it for Delta Crescent, why don't we get another Western company in there to help them? Given the fact that the Northeast is not about to be folded back in with the regime, at least in terms of current policy. There was an existing license, so there is precedent for it. But most importantly, immediately as their license was not renewed and given 3 months to wind down, Gulf Sands Petroleum, now a Russian-controlled company in partnership with Sinochem and the Syrian regime, seems to be reversing their force majeure declaration from 2011, which nullified their original contract. Back in the day, Delta Crescent, back in the day before the revolution, Gulf Sands was a British-owned company, overwhelmingly British-owned company. Now that's changed. So why not move a Western company in there to help? What is going to be the situation? Have the Russians and the Chinese made an offer to the Kurds? And all these details there, I think, are vital to work out, because that's Syria's largest operating oil field. Okay, that's not a small matter. Talk about sectoral issues, it's a major issue. But it's as long as those resources are used for Syrian people, it's fine. The question is who's doing it? Why give it to the Russians and the Chinese when we didn't have to? And that was my major point in raising that in my last article and also subsequently.
Andrew, thank you so much. So we've got not an awful lot of time left, but two sort of big questions I'd like to sort of pose to all of you, and by all means pick and choose whether you want to take one or both. One question is, it's clear that current sanctions on Syria have a limited power to force a change in the regime's behavior. What about the inverse? Can incremental, more for more sanctions relief actually incentivize the regime to make concessions and alter its behavior or not? So that's one question. And then the other question is, given that this administration, and this is a bigger one coming from someone in the Syrian diaspora, given that this administration is most likely to be a single-term one, is it a lost cause to put efforts into trying to change its Syria policy, or should we keep pushing? If so, what would your 2 or 3 recommendations be to push in the direction of Syria policy? So that's a super big question, not just on sanctions. But why don't we start in the initial order that the event was in, and maybe give you each 1 to 2 minutes quick fire to give your thoughts on one or both of those. So Karam, you're up first.
So I don't think I'll be able to answer the first question, because I don't think we can say for now that Joe Biden will have only 1 term in office. I don't know why we would say that at this stage. Now, regarding the first question, I think it's a good idea to take a more for more approach. However, we should not be doing that without having the end in mind. I think this is clear to everyone. Like, what I mean by that, we need to have a policy before we start initiating that, and then seeing what comes next.
Great, and I should just make clear that wasn't my analysis of a 1-term president. That came in the question that I was reading out. Next up,
no, I knew that. Yeah.
Next up, if I remember right, was it Natasha second or Jomana? I forget. Natasha.
Yeah, sure. I'll take the 2 to 3 recommendations for Syria policy, even though that's probably a harder question. But I mean, one thing is, the 2 things that we're throwing at Syria right now are essentially aid and sanctions. So one thing is, I would look at aid. I would do a full-scale audit of what aid is trying to achieve. Is it achieving it? Is it reaching people in need? Is it doing more harm than it should be? I think that the actual answers to that will be more jarring than we're even willing to deal with at the moment, but it needs to happen because we're 10 years in and we're still doing sort of life-saving humanitarian aid. So that has to happen. That's what I've been working on for the past year. And I would argue that Afghanistan is actually a reason rather than an excuse to do that. I worked on Iraq reconstruction, total disaster, even though the U.S. was actually in the country. So I don't think there's any reason to think that it wouldn't be a disaster in Syria another 10 years from now. The other thing is really simple: a Syria envoy, somebody who's actually looking at Syria, on a day-to-day basis, someone who really, really knows Syria and knows the regional actors very, very well, cares about Syria. And then the other thing, and we've talked about this a lot, is, and this is that more for more approach that someone was referring to, but when I've talked to people that are experts on sanctions, and I certainly am not one of those, sanctions tend to work when they're tied to really concrete, achievable goals. So I think we need to, within this sort of assessment of global sanctions policy, we need to start thinking about what sanctions are we willing to tie to concrete, achievable goals. And I think that's another, couple hours discussion, days, weeks discussion, but I think it's possible. So that's, I'll just stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Natasha. Jomana?
On the more for more question, I would say this is something definitely that's been on the table for quite some time. And I know, UN envoy Geir Peterson, before we started the first, the meeting of the Constitutional Committee, one of his main objectives was to try to get anything out of the regime, just as a goodwill gesture that this is a new envoy, we're starting a new page, and maybe we can find ways. And I think part of it was possibly to get something out of the regime. And at the time, it was just the release of child prisoners, right? The hundreds of child prisoners that in Assad regimes, we're not even talking about, men that the regime considers as terrorists. And it wouldn't even release one child under the age of 10. And so there was like, if we can at least get some concession from this, it would show Western countries that are behind a lot of these sanctions that we are moving, at least taking a step in the right direction. And that's never happened. But I agree with Natasha that it does need to be tied to something concrete. I'm just saying that they have been tied to something concrete in the past. We have yet to see any movement in that direction. I think we would all love to see that, but it is going to take some kind of commitment from the regime, Iran and Russia, to show that they're moving also in that direction. Because I do think, frankly, that the West, especially the Biden administration, I mean, it's no secret that they would love to have a different policy towards this, but I think that they have to come back. You can't come back empty-handed. On the one thing I'll say about recommendations is, as I said earlier, is that we can't put all our hopes and dreams into the sanctions basket. There are other things that I know that this administration has prioritized humanitarian aid. It's been life-saving, crucial. I think the Syrian people that receive it are grateful, those that it eventually gets to. And the legal and accountability measures are going to be crucial, I think, absolutely for the next 10, 15 years. People who worked on the Balkans conflict in Bosnia are still pursuing war criminals until today. And so this stuff takes time, it takes commitment. And I do think this administration is committed to those kinds of measures. So let's push it, continue to push it in that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jomana. And Andrew?
It's always easy to go last on these things. A couple of things I would agree with my colleagues, Natasha and Jomana. We definitely need a Syria envoy. We need a senior Syria envoy, someone that can go in and hold meetings and convene people and not just push paper. And that's, unfortunately, we don't have that. There's no good reason for it. It's not like the Democratic Party doesn't have a deep bench in foreign policy. But also, I think the problem is wider than that. We've got a lot of Syria expertise around town. I'm a registered independent, as many of you know. I'm not a partisan person. I think that I've been like that for years. But there are plenty of people around town with Syria expertise, some of whom are on this call, that should be on their way into government and should be working on an envoys team. I think, and I fear, that there are two things going on. One is a lack of prioritization of Syria, which is a mistake, given the way, as I recently argued, the way the regime has metastasized, or the metamorphosis of the regime has created problems for all sorts of sectors of the American security apparatus, not just Syria, but non-proliferation, narcotics, and beyond. And unless we start dealing with that and not pretending there is a problem, then it's not going to go away. And if we just simply allow the Russians and the SDF to cut a deal in the future that folds the Syrian Arab Army and the Syrian Democratic Forces together in one way, shape, or form, I don't think that's going to solve it. We need something better. And from there, you can articulate a policy that makes sense. And I think many of my colleagues on the call today did a far better job than I did talking about that. And I would encourage all people working on Syria on this call and beyond to get together and to share ideas, and also to those in the Democratic Party, go to your representatives, go to your people and say, hey, what's going on with Syria policy? Where is this going? Why is it? The most recent article in Foreign Affairs, I was approached by that publication precisely because no one knew what American Syria policy was. And so we need to have one that's articulated. And this review, which seems to be open-ended, has been going on for so long. How is it that people who were very close to the campaign don't know about what is going on or where this is going? I think it's very detrimental to a positive outcome in Syria and in the Middle East as a whole.
Right. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's a pointed note to end on. Certainly lots more discussions to be had across Syria policy as we hopefully as we move forward. But for now, we're out of time. First off to our panelists, Karam, Natasha, Jomana, Andrew, thank you so much again for taking the time and for providing all of your insights. I know we could have gone on much longer, but I think this was an excellent and very well-rounded conversation. So thank you again for all of your time and insights. And thank you again to our audience for again taking the time to join our event today. There will certainly be more to come. Yes, thank you. Have a good rest of your day, and tune into the Middle East Institute as we continue our work.